This is Seattle, a city surrounded by some of the most beautiful nature in America. But beneath all that scenery lies a truth that most people don't even realize. Seattle is anything but natural. Almost everything about the city has been a product of miraculous environmental engineering, from the lakes to the hills to even the streets. In this regard, it's an outlier to the rest of the country. But how did it end up like this? How did Seattle become such a major city when nature basically said no? And why did people go to such extreme lengths to reshape its environment? Well, contrary to popular belief, it doesn't begin with the Great Seattle Fire that destroyed the entire city center, but rather decades earlier, back when the American pioneer Arthur A. Denny and his party landed at Alki Point in 1851 on the outer edge of Puget Sound, the massive inland sea that defines the entire region. But its exposed position made it too difficult to settle, so the next year, the group abandoned it and moved across to Elliott Bay for a more protected shore. This area here, now known as Pioneer Square, is where Seattle really took root. But here's the thing, the land still didn't really make sense for a city to be born. I mean, it was covered in steep hills, the shoreline was a mess of tidal flats that flooded twice daily, the entire downtown area was barely above sea level, making it prone to constant flooding, and massive cedar and Douglas fir trees made clearing land insanely labor-intensive. Nevertheless, a small settlement began to grow. The reason for this was simple. The land may have been terrible, but Elliott Bay was perfect. It offered a deep, naturally sheltered harbor, and the entire area connected directly to indigenous trade routes along the Duwamish River. For early settlers, a reliable port mattered far more than buildable land, and Elliott Bay was one of the best natural harbors in the entire Pacific Northwest. It's at this point where I think we need to zoom out a bit more from Seattle to see what they were actually working with. Seattle is one of the very few cities that sit on an isthmus, wedged between two completely different bodies of water. To the west is Puget Sound, connecting to the Pacific. To the east is Lake Washington, a massive freshwater lake. And cutting right through the middle is Lake Union, creating a chain of waterways that slice the city into pieces. In other words, Seattle wasn't just founded on awkward terrain. It was founded on a strip of land barely wide enough to hold a city, squeezed between saltwater, freshwater, hills, and bays. Much of the early downtown stood on wooden stilts and plank sidewalks, propped above the mudflats because the ground was too soft and flooded too often to build directly on it. The earliest developments were a form of make-do urbanism, growing where it could, not where it wanted to. We did see early attempts at regrading the landscape. Streets like Jackson, James, and Yesler got their first small cuts in the 1870s in order to make wagon travel possible. Much of what is now the central waterfront is literally built on the landfill generated from these early cuts and the regrades that followed. But everyone still knew the terrain was a disaster. Until one day, when the problem sort of solved itself. June 6, 1889. A small pot of glue boiled over in a downtown cabinet shop, catching nearby wood shavings on fire. Within minutes, flames jumped from building to building, easy to do in a poorly made city. By the end of the day, approximately 25 city blocks, or 125 acres, including the entire business district and waterfront, were destroyed. It ultimately became known as the Great Seattle Fire. This is really the turning point in history of Seattle. Everything was gone, which meant there was essentially a blank slate. And city officials decided that if they had to rebuild the city, then they may as well rebuild the land too. So they did. The mudflats and floods were still a problem, so Seattle engineers decided to raise the street system by almost 20 feet between 1894 and 1905. Here's how it worked. First, they built new stone and brick buildings at the old street level. Then they started filling in the areas between buildings with soil, gradually raising the streets themselves. But this created a weird situation. For years, the ground floors of buildings sat below the new street level. You'd have to climb down ladders to get into shops. Eventually, they built retaining walls and filled in the gaps, and what used to be the ground floor became basements, while the second floor became the new ground floor. This is why today you can take the Seattle Underground tour and walk through the original streets of Pioneer Square, now buried beneath the modern city. It's literally a city built on top of itself. But raising the streets was just the beginning. Seattle still had many bigger engineering challenges to face. Literally, there were the hills. See, the original downtown was squeezed between Elliott Bay and these massive hills, particularly Denny Hill, which rose over 100 feet and blocked any northward growth. So in 1897, city engineer Reginald Heber Thompson proposed something that sounded insane, especially at the time: removing them entirely. This project, known as the Denny Regrade, would become one of the most ambitious earth-moving projects in American history. It was split into two parts. The first, beginning in 1908, started with a technique called hydraulic sluicing, which basically means they used high-pressure water cannons to blast away the hillsides. 20 million gallons of water a day were being pumped from Lake Union, aimed at the entire first half of the hill closest to the waterfront. About 27 city blocks, extending from Pine Street to Cedar Street, were sliced away over a period of 3 years, block by block. By 1911, they'd lowered parts of Denny Hill by up to 107 feet in some areas, but the job was only half done. While Denny Hill was being blasted away in the north, Seattle was simultaneously taking on another massive project to the south, Beacon Hill. The city carved an 85-foot open cut right through the hill to create a tunnel for railway lines to Rainier Valley in the south. Millions of cubic yards of earth were removed, but they weren't just discarded. All that soil was loaded onto rail carts and dumped into the mudflats of the Duwamish River estuary. This created two things. The first was that it filled in the tidal flats, creating the flat industrial land that would become the SoDo district. The other was that it contributed to the creation of Harbor Island. At 350 acres in the middle of the Duwamish waterway, it required 24 million cubic yards of earth to make. When it was completed in 1909, it became the largest artificial island in the world, and even today is still the largest in the US. This wasn't necessarily unique to Seattle. Cities like New York, Boston, and San Francisco all expanded their shorelines with fill, but Seattle's scale of waterfront engineering was disproportionate to its size at the time. They were a city of 80,000 people in 1900, yet they were moving earth and reshaping coastlines like they were a metropolis. But Seattle wasn't done reshaping the Duwamish. See, the river itself was still a problem. Before 1913, it was just a swampy maze of oxbows and mudflats. The river would take 6 to 8 miles to travel what today is covered in just 3 miles. It was completely useless for serious industrial shipping. So between 1913 and 1920, Seattle launched the Duwamish Waterway Project, cutting off the bends, dredging a deep, straight channel, and using all that leftover sediment to expand Harbor Island even further and create more flat industrial land for SoDo, the Port of Seattle, and Boeing Field. The goal was simple: compete with Tacoma for shipping, support new Boeing plants and shipyards, and create massive amounts of buildable industrial land the natural landscape never offered. By 1920, the winding natural Duwamish River had been transformed into an almost perfectly straight industrial waterway. The project shortened the river from about 14 miles to roughly 5 miles, eliminated the wetlands, and built the industrial heartland that would power Seattle's economy for decades. While the river was being reshaped in the south, there was somehow an even more ambitious water project to the north happening at the same time: the Lake Washington Ship Canal. In the early 1900s, Lake Washington and Lake Union were landlocked freshwater lakes sitting about 20 feet above sea level with no connection to Puget Sound. This meant Seattle couldn't use them for maritime commerce, a massive missed opportunity. So city planners came up with a solution: dig a canal connecting the lakes to the ocean. Construction began in 1911 and was completed in 1916. The project created what's now known as Salmon Bay, the Fremont Cut, and the Montlake Cut, basically carving new waterways through the landscape. What's even crazier is that when the canal opened, it permanently lowered Lake Washington by 9 feet overnight, completely rewiring the region's hydrology. And the Black River, which once flowed out of Lake Washington's southern end, disappeared as well. A decade later, it was finally time for the second part of Denny Hill to be sliced away to fully expand the city. It was seen as a half-finished job. So Denny Regrade No. 2 began in February 1929. But this time, it was done differently. Power shovels were now used, with the rubble carried to the waterfront by conveyor belts, placed on specially designed scows, and dumped into deep water off Elliott Bay. By December 1930, the iconic Denny Hill was now completely gone. In total, roughly 50 million tons of earth had been moved. To put that into perspective, that's more Earth than was excavated for comparable sections of the Panama Canal. Today, the entire Denny Regrade area, which includes neighborhoods like Belltown and parts of downtown, sits on what used to be that massive hill. The street grid there is completely different from surrounding areas because it was literally designed from scratch on flat land that didn't exist before 1908. So at this point, Seattle had flattened hills, raised streets, straightened rivers, built artificial islands, and connected lakes to the ocean. But there was yet another problem. The waterfront itself was unstable. See, all the earth they'd been dumping into Elliott Bay was slowly settling and eroding. The original wooden seawalls were rotting, and the entire downtown waterfront was at risk of literally sliding into the bay. So the city began to build a massive seawall to hold it all back. The Alaskan Way Seawall, stretching from Bay Street in the north all the way to South Washington Street, for a total of 7,100 feet. It took until 1936 to finish, because in the northern section the water reached 36 feet deep at high tide, forcing engineers to drive steel pilings into the seafloor and use the weight of the 250,000 cubic yards of fill behind the wall to keep it upright. It's one of the only seawalls in the world that doesn't just protect a shoreline. It's physically holding up an entire downtown built on artificial land. Finally, there was one problem left for Seattle to solve. Remember how they lowered Lake Washington by 9 feet to connect it to Puget Sound? Well, that made it incredibly important for transportation and commerce. But it also created this massive barrier cutting the east side from downtown. And here's the issue. Lake Washington is over 200 feet deep in places, with a lake bed made of soft glacial sediment. So traditional bridges wouldn't work here. So rather, they decided to invent something completely new. The modern floating bridge. Emphasis on modern here, as I know floating bridges have been used centuries before. Anyways, in 1940, they opened the Lacey V. Murrow Memorial Bridge, the world's first major concrete floating bridge and the longest floating bridge on Earth at the time. So instead of sinking pillars down to the lake bed like a normal bridge, they built massive hollow concrete pontoons that float on the surface of the lake, and the roadway then sits on top of them. And they didn't stop at one. Today, Seattle has 3 floating bridges on Lake Washington alone, the highest concentration of floating bridges on Earth. Most cities don't even have one. 2 of them are the only permanent floating bridges in the world that carry full interstate freeways. Meanwhile, the current Evergreen Point floating bridge, completed in 2016, is the longest floating bridge in the world at 7,710 feet. Before that, the 1963 version of it held the record. Seattle has basically been breaking its own world records for floating bridges since 1940. Of course, there have been other major geoengineering projects accomplished since then, but in my eyes, these are the most iconic. No other city in America has reshaped itself as radically as Seattle. It arguably shouldn't exist the way it does today, yet it does, thanks to the city's determination. Today, it's the biggest city in the Pacific Northwest, with a metro population of over 4 million people, making it the 15th largest in the US total. Seattle is a top 3 tech hub in the US, home to giants like Amazon, Microsoft, Boeing, and Starbucks, and the birthplace of the grunge music scene. But all of this has come at a cost, specifically an environmental one. Entire ecosystems were destroyed to make this vision possible. The Duwamish River, once home to thriving salmon runs, has become one of the most polluted waterways in America. The tidal flats and wetlands that were filled in had been critical habitat for birds and marine life. The neighborhoods built on filled mudflats and regraded hillsides now sit on some of the most unstable ground in the region. In a major earthquake, much of this artificial land is at risk of liquefying, literally turning into liquid, causing buildings and roads to sink or tilt. And as sea levels rise due to climate change, some of that artificial coastline is at risk of flooding. But despite this, there's no denying that it was worth it. The major engineering projects allowed it to grow into what it is today. Thank you for watching.